So this is just 3 slides on set the stage, and then we're going to have a conversation. But this is literally just set the stage. And there's a ton of stuff out there about the metaverse. You can probably Google it, and it's going to give you a definition. So this is our view of a very relatively implementable definition of the metaverse. And essentially, it's a virtual world that exists online, right? So that's the basic core of it. If you knew, 10 years ago, there was something called Second Life. Some of you may have heard of it. Second Life was this very, very early version of the metaverse, but it worked on the internet. It was pathetic, to put it mildly. So basically, the industry is trying to build the next version, which is a lot more exciting, a lot more interactive, a lot more immersive. And it's going to take some time to get there. But essentially, it's taking a 3D virtual world and getting everyone to interact with each other with avatars. Now, avatars are evolving as we speak today. There's people have seen versions where it's half-bodied, sitting around a conference table. Looks quite okay, but it's not real. So getting to a real version of human is sort of the evolution. And of course, we'll access it via the internet. We will use some sort of VR, AR, virtual reality, augmented reality, sensory tool, just so you can capture the experience. There's some sort of payment mechanism because there needs to be a business model around it, obviously. And then things to actually bring objects into 3D. Okay, so that's sort of the principle of how the metaverse would be built and sort of the baseline for it. So what powers it? I'm not going to go into technology, I promise you. I'm just going to touch on a couple of these. So we talked about data quite a bit in the afternoon, actually for a couple of hours already. And that data is sort of the basic layer to build AI or to build AI models, which needs to be done for the metaverse to make it real for all of us. There is augmented reality and virtual reality. You'll see a couple of things later on, but essentially you see people wearing headsets today or things on their head. Used to be about 1.5 kilos on your head, terrible experience. It's evolving to a couple hundred grams right now, and it's going to get smaller over time. Internet of Things is essentially sensors around the world, put everywhere to make this virtual world real. Blockchain is essentially from the fintech world, but essentially implemented so you can actually make some of this data protectable and unique and traceable as well. And then the last thing is edge computing. It's sort of tied to Internet of Things, but essentially it's technology that helps data get faster to where you want it to be so you get a decent experience. Second Life was terrible, but this is going to get better. And then in sports, what's going to happen? So a lot of the conversation here is about improving the fan experience. So it's a lot more immersive, a lot more conversational, a lot more natural. And there's a couple of things that you'll see as we talk through this. So one is about multi-view camera technology. So the more cameras I have, the more I can capture the experience. Can I expose that experience to fans? So that's one angle. You can actually step into a virtual pitch or a virtual stadium or a virtual match. So that's another example. And then think about running a race and your family standing at different points in the race, but over 42 kilometers, they have absolutely no idea where you are. They might. There's some stuff going on, but could you just give me that experience of me running in the middle of that run as a family member? So I know you could be miles away, but I know that you're running up this hill, for example. So these are just things that would improve the fan engagement experience. So do you want to come back on?
Yeah, sure.
And do you know what I'd say, just to start the conversation, is I don't know if all these things look kind of very strange and very flat, but just try them. Just literally try them. And I think, Raja does the GSIC, but it's all about showing people what to do. And when you see things like the AR goggles, just try them. And there's a running thing out there that's quite funny. And, it's just a question of trying it. And the more you try it, and I think even when we're talking about NFTs, I didn't really know what they were until I sort of got my first one. And you go, thank you. That's how it works. So all I was just going to say to start it was have some fun after this and just try all this stuff that you hear about.
I mean, I'll share this story real quickly. So we took a bunch of people, actually about 100 people, to the Microsoft Experience Center, which is in Singapore. Extremely rich environment, lots of technology. And we just got everyone to put on their headset. The actual HoloLens headset. Yeah, and literally everyone was doing this, right? That is the exact experience. But at the end of it, when you have the conversation, there were eyes lighting up. Because it actually really, really works. It's still not there yet, it's still not light enough, etc., but it works. So yeah.
And also, I'd say, I don't think you have to understand all these things as well. Don't try and understand them all, because they're also kind of complex and sort of, technically difficult. But it's just to sort of spiritually understand that, I think digital media is moving on, isn't it? And if you think, great memory from Second Life, and kind of the idea of metaverses has been around for a while, and it's starting to kind of come together. But I think it's just interesting that people are just accepting it more and just getting more involved because the technology is better, and it's just a more immersive and fun place to be.
So I spoke quite a bit about metaverse, but what about the Web3 angle, the Web3 world? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think in all these funny, strange words, I think the only thing for me about Web3 is about digital ownership, and I think it's a very strange thing to say. But if you think about games at the moment, like I don't know what your friends or family might play, but things like Fortnite, all you're doing is kind of renting it, or you're paying for upgrades, or Roblox, you play a subscription, but you're always just paying the games company. And I think what will happen in Web3 is that actually you own those things. So if you buy something or you earn it because you've been playing really well, it's yours, physically yours, and you can sell it. You can give it to someone. It's yours to sell. It's not always just the games company extractively taking money from you. It's actual digital ownership. And I think that idea is really, really powerful. It's yours to own. It's not somebody else's. It's not renting it from a company who's making gazillions out of you. It's yours, and that's really what Web3 brings to it. And I think that's an interesting kind of spin.
It's fascinating what you say about ownership. 10 years ago, one would talk to sports federations or governments or brands about websites and apps. And then Facebook happened. And then YouTube was already there, and Twitter happened, and Instagram happened. About 2015, I began talking about opportunities for publishing for an IP owner, be they sport, gaming, media, government, tourism board, whatever. And I made the distinction between owned platforms, websites and apps, and loaned platforms, which are fundamentally social media networks. The idea being that on an owned platform, you can actually get details about your consumer, which is today called first-party data in fancy terms. Whereas on loaned platforms, you are a tenant. The consumer belonged to you only in that moment. And the arbitrage that platform was doing, as we very well know from Cambridge Analytica and all that kind of stuff, was way behind the curve in the regulation. So I think I'm making 2 points. One, there's a distinction to be made between owned data as opposed to loaned data. It fundamentally has a discretionary mechanism in this decade, Web3 does, which allows me to allow someone else the terms on which they can use my data. So just as it was on the publishing side, on the supply side 10 years ago, I think it's now come on to the demand side from a consumer perspective.
I completely agree with that, and I think there's a colleague of mine who's used to work for Facebook and agencies, just trying to mine data and sell it to kind of advertisers to be most efficient, and he's now kind of called it, was it poacher turned gamekeeper, and now he's setting up a thing called TapX, where people can own their own Facebook data and sell it back to Mark Zuckerberg, which is just kind of empowering, and it'll take a while for it all to catch on, but it's just an interesting time where things are just changing to be, to empower people to be able to, own their own data.
I mean, I think when you think about the younger generation, part of the reason they went off Facebook is because everyone else was there, right? So that's one angle. But there's a principal conversation about who owns the data, and sometimes you don't care. Like if you're using Instagram, you don't care. But when you use some technology and you understand that ads are being served to you and you don't like it, you want to own, you want to control how your data is actually shared. So there's a bit of a social thing going on.
I'll give you a personal example. 2017, in the course of 6 weeks, I found that's when WhatsApp began getting used a lot more in the West. In Asia, it's always been followed, but a lot more in the West, especially in the UK, Sweden, parts of the US where one was doing business. And I would be using WhatsApp, and I'd log off, and I'd open my Facebook app, and all of these work colleagues were suddenly going to be friend recommendations. And the second time around, we were talking about something at home, and I opened the app again, and an ad got served. I just felt extremely violated, fundamentally, which, it's a very different dynamic, and I've never been on Facebook since. And the flip side is, not being on Facebook has suddenly given me 1 hour a day of time, which I'd otherwise be scrolling through. So there's been a massive sort of lifestyle, but also there was fundamentally a moral and psychosomatic reason, which then led me to sort of go off that. And even the discussion around our daughter being able to be on Instagram, it's a conversation. It's not something that we're going to give in to it, because you know where and what this can happen outside of oversight. So as a professional, as a parent, as an individual, as a citizen, these are fairly gory details.
And some of the Web3 stuff is going to solve that. There are already companies starting to look at it. So, it will take some time, but maybe we'll come back to sports and just show an example. Can we play the video?
Press it again. Yay, there you go. Is it possible to play the video? There you go. Maybe you want to give some narrative of what it is.
So what you're watching is actually the Brooklyn Nets, a real game, but in the Metaverse. And there are about 100 cameras installed in the stadium. So if you're a fan, you get to switch your viewing angle, if you will, depending on what you want to see. So, you could be watching a free throw and you exactly want to watch a free throw, or you could zoom out and watch the entire match from a top-down view, or your favorite player and tracking for the entire journey. And this is literally just one possibility, but at the moment it's using 100 cameras, and the more cameras you get, the more angles you can watch, for example. But it's a live video feed that you could translate into this. It will take time to get super real, but I think this is where we could get to at some point.
Can I just say one thing? I think as we look at a generation which is fundamentally used to 30 seconds and 90-second videos, the density of content per second and the ability to be able to play around with perspectives becomes a very important part of engaging that demographic, which may not seem obvious to all of us. And therefore, as someone who worked in television, when the gamification of a broadcast happens because of a technology, you realize that your sub-30 generation can actually be engaged, simply because there's so much more going on, which they're in a position to actually process.
And I mean, honestly, in the gaming world today, you do a lot of this already. Not exactly this, but a version of this, right? So you can get different angles depending on where you're running down, and there's some amount of experience that, again, I'm saying the younger generation, but people younger than us are used to it. This is very natural. So this is just implementing what is already existing in gaming.
Just think it adds, it is their identity. So it's literally how good they are in a game, or whether they can have access to these things. It defines who they are, and it's just a mindset change. And I think for sports particularly, there's a kind of idea that the screen is bad, running on a track and or playing on a football pitch is good. And there's a certain, I understand, but I think it's just understanding that a generation, anyone kind of growing up that's been involved with gaming, their digital identity is part of who they are. So you just need to marry them together rather than try and separate them. It's just understanding who they are.
Well, let's take another example then. So this is the HoloLens. Essentially, it's a Microsoft headset. There's an Oculus headset in Facebook. It does exactly the same thing. And the version you see here on your left is essentially where the technology's evolved to. You used to cover your entire head all the way down to half your face. It looked horrible. It looked ugly. It was 1.5 kilos. And it's now, reaching the point where it's becoming a bit real. So let's see if I can play this.
Here is going to be forehand drills going down the line, cross-court and inside out, all targeting kind of mostly the backhand corner and then some to the forehand corner, of the opponent, but trying to stay within this area.
It's funny that the back of the video towards the end, suddenly there's an ad which pops up about tennis scholarships. And as a parent, I'm sure a lot of you in the audience are in the same situation, we are the most inelastic consumers. We would do anything at whatever the price it might be available for our child. And we start looking at from that economics perspective of how a certain investment or a certain pastime that is made, the demand in terms of economics is quite significant. It's quite significant.
I mean, I'm a tennis player, and my first reaction was, would I ever wear a HoloLens to train? I mean, I would rather work with a real human. But when I spoke to someone who's 16 years old, and I showed him the video, and he said, yeah, sure. It's light enough today, so I might. Because preferably it's lighter, but sure. So it's, again, it's an overlay of the virtual world onto the real world. So this is not 100% metaverse, if you will, but it's a real implementation of possibilities.
Yeah, and I think just all these things become so immersive. And, you know, like if you go to Decentraland or you just see, you know, some of the gaming, it's so immersive. I totally understand why, you know, kind of gamers spend 3-4 hours a day. I think I've read a statistic recently that said gamers are something like 40% of all people under 30, and they spend the best part of a working day every week in their game. And you're like, wow, they're really investing in it. So just how people understand and operate in those kind of immersive, you know, worlds, and we're kind of competing against it, and it's almost like just understanding that these things are really quite powerful, and how as parents and as athletes we kind of work with them. It's going to be interesting.
So let's just take another example. This is actually an Australian company that's overlaying 3D virtual worlds, if you will, within the physical world. So let you watch this, and then we can.
I love it. I just, you know, how things like AR and just being able, you know, because I think the other thing that's really different from sort of Second Life days is the mobile phone. And it's just that all those apps are freely available on your phone right now, and you can just, you know, walk around Bangkok and just see weird and wonderful things instantly. And that's just kind of, that'll be the kind of the way that people consume this kind of, you know, it's their reality. It's their reality, and it's so accessible. It's great.
Yeah, you don't even need actual new technology. You don't need to wear a headset. It's a natural experience on your mobile. I'm trying to figure out how to bring this back to the world of running and mass participation. So, any thoughts?
I think this goes back to the demographic test, which is highly scientific and highly impactful, that Chris ran this morning. You know, you're talking about kids, and I think this is a very important piece to be able to actually use them to get them involved very, very early.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think it's just incentivizing people in the right way. But yeah, it doesn't sort of seem to be completely kind of an obvious, you know, marriage between sort of running and, you know, these wonderful worlds. But I think, you know, we're just looking at ways that you can meet in Decentraland and meet other runners there. And there are just places you can, you know, kind of express yourself that you can't really in social media. That you don't have these kind of, you know, these places you can go. And I think that kind of what will happen just over time is it will just become a normal part of what, you know, all of you do, so that when you have, you know, You can have meetings outside of, if you've got events that happen only once a year or twice a year, you can have meetings that happen more frequently. There are just ways to use it as a very sort of simple tool that aren't hard to do, but are just fun. And that just adds engagement to all your events.
I was talking to the guys at Ironman, and they've begun something called the Ironman Club. And I was speaking to the guys at ASO in Paris who do the Tour de France. And there was interest through COVID for the different sort of provinces of France that the race goes through to actually virtualize the entire race. So the idea being that if I'm a lay runner, a non-professional competitive cyclist, would it be possible for me to actually, and I'm training at home on a stationary bike, is it possible for me to actually do the hill climbs and the flats, as the case might be? And that has led to a very large adoption from the tourism boards, because they actually want to be part of this entire narrative. And if you look at what Zwift is doing and all that kind of stuff, then all of a sudden you can see different parts. The hardware manufacturer, the event promoter, the tourism board, and as I was saying earlier in the previous panel, a race which has got credibility and brand recall. These are different layers on top of what is going on in a physical world. Then from physical you go into physical and digital world. From there you go into a virtual world. So it's really a sort of a step process, and I see very clearly different segments which will fit into the 3 different layers, and you go from there.
I think in the near term, that's exactly what it's going to be. So Super League Triathlon is essentially treadmill, Zwift, and a swim in the reservoir, right, for example. It's a real race. It's very exciting for fans. It's very exciting for someone participating. It works. But in the near term, it's going to be something of that sort. So I guess we could see a virtual, physical marathon.
I mean, a lot of times when sort of people talk to me about augmented reality and virtual reality, I just try and keep it simple. I said, let's just talk about mixed reality. Just keep it simple. It's not physical entirely. It's not digital entirely. It's not entirely immersive, because you're, even though you have something on and you're feeling, like if you go to a Disneyland show or whatever, you have the 3 or 4 senses working at you, but physically you know that you are in the same space where you left it before the show started. But it's mixed. There's no going away from the fact that it's mixed. And once you start saying that you can be actually in 2 different realities at the same time, in a common seamless experience, then it's a very different way of being, and you go from there. It's very, very different.
Right, yeah, I think we'll just take a moment to talk about 2 quite interesting projects which are very sort of Web3, NFT based. One of them is called Dustland Runner, which I don't think anyone would have heard of, but it's by an Animoca brand company called OliveX. And basically, their idea is to get people out of the metaverse and running. So you're like, excellent, okay, I understand that. And the way they do that is actually through almost like a podcast. Every week there are the idea is you're in a kind of weird and wonderful post-apocalyptic world, and you've got to do quests and tasks based on your listening to the audio as you run. So you've got to do certain things, go a certain speed, a certain distance, and so on. And by doing that, which is measured on your phone, you accumulate points and tokens, which actually rewards you physically, financially, ostensibly. And then the other one, who's heard of Steppen? Has anyone a Steppen runner here? There's a Steppen person there. Steppen has been a really interesting project. I think, basically the idea was on a mass participation scale, but individuals running individually, that you could go out of your front door. You would have to buy a token, but you could go out of your front door and run and be rewarded with a token. I mean, for good or for real, it'll be interesting to see what the discussion afterwards in the bar, but I think, it's been shown to be a little bit difficult because you're directly paying people to run, and the economics didn't really stack up over time. So Steppen's had a bit of a kind of...
That's very simple. When you live in a 0% borrowing loan economy, you can do that. If you're in 4% plus, which is fundamentally we've been for the last 100 years, then reality bites. But that does not mean that the rewarding of an anticipated and repeat behavior, which is the essence of a loyalty program from air miles to retail, as the case might be, cannot actually be in a currency which is non-cash, doesn't have to be crypto, it's fundamentally credits. And you do that, and again, you're rewarding certain behaviors. So the economics don't change. The familiarity is not that far apart from where we are. And then, you sort of go from there. I'm just curious if there are any comments from the audience rather than questions, because I'm sure I've seen a few heads bobbing, and none of you are Indian, so obviously something has resonated. Any comments from the audience, please? Someone in the front here seems pretty keen.
It's late.
Unless you want me to start pointing at your fingers, or you want to go to the bar, which is fine.
I think we should wrap up.
Okay, I think they're basically saying, thanks ever so much, don't overstay your welcome. All right.
Any final comments? I mean, any final thoughts, if you will? Otherwise, we should wrap up, I think.
No, happy to wrap up and see you in the bar if you've got any sort of thoughts about how it all comes out, because I think that's the place to go now.
I think I want to go to a 2D world and have a 2D beer with 2D people, so I'll leave it there. Thank
All
you very
right.
much. You've been a
Thank
very
you.
patient audience. Thank
Thanks
you,
a lot.
guys.